Okay, now the lecture is really going to be about the changing fortunes of classical liberalism. If you look back in the 19th century, largely as a result of Adam Smith, David Hume, and then John Stuart Mill, you had an agreement, a sort of consensus about economic policy, which was effectively laissez-faire. Laissez-faire meant the government intervention was limited to what were providing the essential public goods. Gladstone insisted on balanced budgets, and you had a gold standard. Okay? And this was, if you like, the laissez-faire regime, of which free trade was an integral part. So that is the first phase. The second phase is, you can really say it starts at the end of the 19th century, I would say. I mean, it's very difficult to actually date it. In fact, one part of Mill actually leads to this thing, but we won't go into that. But from that till the end of the Second World War, you had what you can call the collectivist phase. This is the time when they said laissez-faire doesn't work. Keynes wrote a favorite book called The End of Laissez-Faire, but I'll show you that what he really didn't argue for much, which is very different from what the classical liberals were arguing. But that then led to this notion of market failure. Pigou wrote a very important book called The Economics of Welfare, which created all these various exceptions to the laissez-faire case. And of course, that also meant that people said that the case for free trade was no longer valid. So government intervention for all sorts of reasons, including protection for various reasons, became the norm. Okay, so that led to what I call it the collectivist phase. And if you want, if you're Soviet, Russia, communist, they were all paradigms of this. But this was also taken up by many third world countries, and that continued after the Second World War. Now, the third phase starts from the 1950s, and I call it the social democratic phase. And I was associated with many of the people who were part of this intellectual, sometimes called the neoclassical revolution in development economics. But here what happened was, and I'll show you the arguments for this in a minute, what happened was that you had a separation of the case for laissez-faire from that for free trade. What the argument now was that even if you have to have government intervention for all sorts of reasons, market failure, that still did not justify protection. That the best combination now was some government intervention for various market failure type reasons, but you should still maintain free trade. And I call this a social democratic phase, as we'll see in a minute. Now, I was not quite happy with this, so I wrote an article which I think might be in your reading list here, which showed that actually, if you follow this argument through of the second phase, and we'll see that if you bring in political economy reasons like rent seeking, which we'll discuss in a minute, then in fact we're back again. We'll find that in fact the case for laissez-faire also is restored apart from free trade. That's why the wheel has come full circle. In my view, we've got back again to the 19th century classical liberal package. Okay? Now I want to say one thing on this about in this third phase, all the other arguments for protection were shown to be really arguments for other government intervention, not protection, not departing from free trade. And the basic argument was that all these arguments based on market failure, which were called domestic distortions in the working of the domestic price mechanism, and we'll look at a couple of examples in a minute, all these really required some domestic tax subsidy measure to deal with that distortion. And if you started interfering with foreign trade, that in fact very often didn't cure that distortion, and it led to all sorts of other byproduct distortions which made things even worse. Now there was only one case, a case in which well, a tariff is really not a good argument. I can call it the optimum tariff argument. Now think of Saudi Arabia, any oil producer. They have monopsony power in foreign markets. That means they can, as they've done, like through OPEC, they can raise their prices of their exports by putting on what's called an optimum tariff, but essentially a tax, export tax, which actually raises the price. So that is in some sense exploiting foreigners, which doesn't hurt you. You're not concerned about the welfare of foreigners. So that argument for intervention in foreign trade is still valid. Okay? But all the other arguments require you to deal with the distortion at source. If there's some distortion, you must deal with that. Okay, now let's get on to the okay, now this diagram is absolutely crucial. This sets out the argument for, and I'll show you that all these successes, you can demonstrate it all. Now, a very simple supply and demand diagram, and this is just for consider some good which can be imported, okay? And the good under free trade, that's the price of the good is OPT. That's the demand curve. And I'm going to explain the supply curve in a minute. Okay, so that's the actual supply curve at domestic prices. So under free trade, domestic production will be OQ1, Q1, Q2, Q2 will be imported, right? Now, here's the domestic distortions coming in. Now, you can think of the SS curve as the true social supply curve. Why? The distortion could be in the labor market, could be in the factor market. The labor market is an old argument going back to Manilescu, who said that in many third world countries, developing countries, the industrial wage is well above the true social opportunity cost of employing labor. So for that reason, when you industrialize, you're not getting the optimum quantity of industrialization or import substitution because of this distortion. So that means the social supply curve, or the true social opportunity cost of labor, would lie below the market-determined supply curve. And the same thing can also be shown for the infant industry argument. Okay, so let's take this wage distortion case. So that's the social supply curve. If you didn't have this distortion, what would happen? That means under free trade, producers would be working at world prices. Okay, but if they're operating on the social supply curve, and the government has done this somehow, then domestic production of this good would be OQ3 and not OQ1. Okay, so what were the gains and losses from this? As a result of this, Q1, Q3 extra domestic production, you'd save foreign exchange of that area there. Okay? Now, all that foreign exchange is not a savings. Why? Because even on the social supply curve, the true social costs of this extra output is that area there. So what you'll be left with, the social gain, something called the production gain, would be this little triangle there. Okay? So because of this domestic distortion, you're operating under free trade, and you haven't done anything of shifting the supply curve from there to there, you're losing that potential production gain. Okay, so the argument comes, let's have protection. What happens with protection? You raise the price of the good by a tariff to PD, which gives you, on the domestic existing market supply curve, gives you the same optimum output, OQ3. Okay? Stop me whenever anything is not clear. What does that mean? That means with that higher price, with the tariff, that gives the tariff, that's the tariff, you're now going to get this extra production gain because you've indirectly dealt with the domestic distortion. So that's what policymakers said, oh, lovely, yes, we are not industrializing enough, we get this extra output, we put on a tariff and we get this production gain. But hang on, as if you rate the price of this good, what happens to consumption on the demand curve? Well, consumption of this good goes down by Q4, Q2. What does that imply? True, if you're not importing Q4, Q2, you'll be saving all that amount in foreign exchange, that amount in foreign exchange, which can be used for any other purposes, like gold, you can use for any other purposes. But the total loss in consumer surplus is the area of the demand curve, so it's D, E, Q3, Q2, F, of which that is saved. So you have a net consumption loss of that area. So what has the tariff done? The tariff has given you a production gain of that area and to be set against this consumption loss of that area. And as you see, as I've drawn it, at the end of the day, there's no gain or loss. You're exactly where we were. And of course, depending upon the elasticity of the demand curve and supply curve, this area could be even bigger than this. You could actually have a net social loss. Okay, now let's go down. So clearly the tariff need not necessarily improve welfare. So how do you deal with this domestic distortion? Well, the first best is exactly what I started off with. That is, you deal with this by giving a production subsidy to producers so that the supply curve becomes a social supply curve. And you keep free trade, so there's no consumption loss, but you get the production gain. Okay? Now here, a bit of sleight of hand, which I'll relax in a minute. Now you say you give a production subsidy. How is this production subsidy going to be financed? Now in all these cases, they say it's financed by lump sum taxes. And the subsidy is also given lump sum. So there's no distortion yet. So let's just go down. Okay, but remember this distortion which we have here, which is represented by, that's a social supply curve. What is the distortion? I said it's a wage differential. The industrial wage is too high, right? Now what is happening here? That means now the producers will still be using, because you're not giving a wage subsidy at the moment, that you're giving a production subsidy. So what will happen? The wage that they'll be paying will still be much higher than the right wage. What that means is they'll still be using too little labor compared to capital in producing the good. Okay, so what should the government do? It should in fact give a wage subsidy. Okay? With the wage subsidy, it does not, the choice of techniques as it's called is still optimum. You get the production gain and there's no consumption loss because you haven't distorted prices. If you can't, but there's a whole hierarchy of policy, you keep going down this. Suppose the government can't give a wage subsidy, it can't give a production subsidy, it has to, so we can do a whole hierarchy of policies. Okay, and the basic point is that at the end of the day, the tariff, this will be the worst. In this hierarchy of alternative policies, the tariff is the worst of all possible policies. And in fact, given the consumption loss, it might not actually give you any welfare. Is that okay? I'm going to go on. Okay. The next stage in the argument is, remember I started saying that the government is giving these subsidies by levying lump sum taxes. Now, if you look at the history of lump sum taxes, the last attempt was by Mrs. Thatcher to put on a poll tax. Now, in principle, you know, it's an ideal tax because a poll tax or any other lump sum tax, there are none of these little triangle losses in consumer welfare. You're not distorting relative prices in any way. But unfortunately, right through history, poll taxes have been very unpopular. I don't know how many of you have been in England, but if you go around the countryside, you'll see many windows are blocked in. They're still old houses. And this is because there was a window tax which was levied, I can't remember, some medieval king. And to avoid it, people locked in their windows. The other thing with the poll tax is there are riots. People don't like just being taxed on head count. People consider it unfair. So it's virtually impossible to levy that. So what does that mean? That means if you are going to give this subsidy, either a production subsidy or a wage subsidy, you will have to raise taxes somewhere else. Okay, what does a tax do? A tax, supposing it's commodity, you put a tax on, now this is a commodity tax, say this is clothes, you put a tax on clothes. That will then, irrespective, and you're still operating, let's say, on the social supply curve, that again will lead to a distortion on the consumption side with a consumption loss like that. So what this means is that what we are now comparing actually are consumption losses against any production gain, which is on the consumption side, little triangles like this, when you're raising commodity taxes. So what does this mean? This means this whole theory of protection really becomes a part of public finance. Why? What is a tariff? Tariff is nothing else but a production subsidy which gives you this production gain, and a consumption tax which finances this with that loss. So people say, well, that's not, there's no knockdown argument. Now here enter the latest stage in public finance. A lot of Nobel Prizes, in my view, unjustly been given for it, called public economics. Now the roots of public economics go back to a famous paper written by Frank Ramsey, who was a pupil and associate of Keynes. And Keynes gave him this problem. He said, what is a set of taxes which would minimize, to raise a fixed amount of revenue, which would minimize these consumption losses, because all commodity taxes lead to distortions, or even income taxes. Income taxes lead to losses like that, choices between income and leisure. Okay, so what would minimize this? Well, Ramsey came up with the answer, which you can immediately see in this diagram. What you need to tax are goods in inelastic demand. So supposing this demand curve was virtually inelastic, there'd be no consumption loss. Okay? So the optimum set of taxes, these are called the Ramsey Rules, if you like, are you tax goods with the lowest inverse elasticity of demand. And of course governments do that. Cigarettes, various other things like that, you tax. So the argument then became, well, as long as the government is following optimal tax policy, right, it can always find a set of optimal taxes, i.e. taxes which are taxing goods with relatively inelastic demands, rather than relying upon a production subsidy financed by implicit tax on consumption of that particular good as in a tariff. Okay? So that meant that you had the same hierarchy which came together. Next stage. Ann Kruger and many other people, all of us said, look, one of the troubles with this whole argument is that this is actually based on assuming that all the protection, particularly in developing countries, was in the form of tariffs. But if you're wandering around the third world, much less so now, in the 50s and 60s, most of the protection, intervention in international trade was in the form of import quotas. Now, import quotas can be made equivalent to a tariff. Remember, what we've got here is we want to increase the production of this good with a social supply curve lying below the market one by Q1, Q3. We can either put on a tariff of PDPT, or else we can impose an import quota of Q3, Q4. That means the government says no more of cloth. You can only import Q3, Q4 of cloth. And they then give out import licenses to lucky people. We'll come to that in a minute, who the lucky people are. They give them import licenses, and they must add up to no more than Q3, Q4 of cloth. Okay, now if they've done that, given that domestic supplies owe Q3, Q3 for an import license, you'll get exactly the same domestic price as we would have a tariff of PDPT. So the import quota is equivalent to a case where you actually put on a tariff of PDPT. Okay, now what about these import licenses? Well, if you're lucky enough to get an import license, what happens? You have an import license, so you can import Q3, Q4 units of cloth at the price Q3B, which is the world price, and given this total supply and demand configuration, you can sell it for Q3G. So you're going to get these profits on these import licenses just by virtue of having access to this person who's issuing the license. And this, of course, became an immense source of corruption. In Ghana, ladies of easy virtue wanted to, sell their favors to bureaucrats, used to stand us out, lined out outside top import controllers' offices, offering their services for an import license. And this then became a source of what came to be called rent seeking. Why? Because these Q3, Q4, that quantity import licenses, that's what you pay to import the quantity, that's what you receive. Now this is not earned, this is pure rents for anyone who's lucky enough to get an import license. Okay, so what are people going to do? Because there's a competition for import licenses. You're going to spend your own resources, could be bribes, could be waiting time, could be libidinous pledges, anything at all. How much? You'll be willing to spend until you'll spend the last pound or dollar until to whittle away the last pound and dollar there. So the total amount of resources that these rent seekers are going to spend will be this whole area, GBDE, which is also just like throwing resources into the sea. And that means now there's a knockdown case for saying protection is the worst possible way, particularly through import quotas, of getting any production gain, because this rent-seeking loss will outweigh any production gain, even if we forget about the consumption loss there. Okay? So we're back again saying the best thing is some tax subsidy measure, ideally using optimal taxes, to get the production gain, to move this market supply curve down to the social supply curve and keep free trade. Okay, now here's the other twist, which is in this paper, which I think. Now remember, to get this production gain, okay, for which you're giving your production subsidy, what's going to happen? Now a chap goes to the government official, import licensing chap, and he says, by the way, my wages are much higher than the competitive wage because, some trade unions put up wages or what have you. Okay, please give me a production subsidy. Now, is there any way in which the import licensor can know that this is right? He's generally got this distortion, and the size of this distortion is that? Very unlikely. In any case, given the uncertainty attached to this, a lot of people will lie. They'll say, we actually suffer from production distortion. Okay? And if they can convince the government that they should be given a production subsidy, what will they gain? There's no social gain. Okay? You're still maintaining free trade. The actual supply curve is, in fact, the social supply curve. There's no distortion, right? But they're getting the government to give them a subsidy, assuming that is their supply curve. So what are they gaining? They're gaining a special producer rents of that area there, over and above, whatever that's their production costs for that quantity. So they're now getting this extra gain as if their price had been raised to the subsidy, and that is the producer rent they're going to get through subsidy seeking. And there are a lot of examples of this. So what happens? The government can't know this. So now if you take the rent-seeking argument here, this subsidy-seeking loss will always be greater than even any potential producer gain if these people were true. And you can never know this. That means you're completely uncertain. So what should you do? Forget about the subsidy game. We've already forgotten about protection. And where are we back? We're back to laissez-faire and free trade. Okay? Any questions on that before I go on? Yep.
But the loss is on a national level, and the gain is on an individual level. Is it possible to convince individuals that they should?
But this is not a true gain in the last case. They're lying. They claim this is the gain, but this is not. I mean, if there was a true gain, that's a separate. This is not. This is the claim they're making, but it's untrue. I mean, the government chap says I'm uncompetitive, produces all sorts of figures. Well, how do you know? And remember, he's also bribing these other people. Part of that is bribes. So once you bring this political economy factor, then of course this whole case collapses. Okay, any questions on that? I'll go on then. Okay, so essentially what we had was what goes by the name of public policy, and what we teach people in terms of modern day public finance, which is really public policy. It's all based on this so-called second-best welfare economics. Okay? But unfortunately, you have to take a view both about the economic agents in this world, economy, and of course about the state. Now this whole theory of public economics, these optimal taxes, etc., they're all based that human beings are angels, and of course all our rulers are platonic guardians. So they're looking after our welfare. But unfortunately, I and all the old classical economists took a rather dimmer view of, well, essentially we all accept that human beings are, what can we call them? We are all fallen angels. But the state, you can't assume that human agents are selfish, greedy and all this, and the state somehow in fact consists of platonic guardians looking after our welfare. And if you take a more cold-eyed view of the state, the best way of looking at the state, and you can look around, most states have been predatory. People recognize this, for instance, in old monarchies. The rulers were interested in maximizing revenue, partly to get armies, mistresses, and of course providing some public goods, otherwise they'd be overthrown. But they were not looking after the welfare of the prey. So I look upon this, the best analogy is a natural world model between predators and prey. Now predators in the wild are indirectly interested in the welfare of their prey. Why? Because the fatter the prey, better their meals. So they don't want to completely hope that the prey will starve. Similarly, governments are interested up to a point in providing the goods which prevent anarchy. So somehow they're interested in providing some of these public goods, but their ultimate aim is to maximize revenue which they can extract. What is the limit to this? The limit to this depends upon the contestability of the state. That means from rivals, from within coups, from outside, or in democracies from other political parties. So a democracy is not prone to predation. Unfortunately, that's not either true. Why? Because in democracies, if you look at any simple political economy models, and there are lots of these, the simple model is that a democratic society or democratic model, in fact, maximizes the welfare of the median voter. So it redistributes income from both hands. In a lot of cases, in welfare states, you see exactly this. That the median voter gets benefits from both the poorest and the richest in society. So in democracies, the predator is a median voter. So to think that somehow they're platonic guardians is also false. Okay, so once you take account of this, then as we've seen in this rent-seeking case, it's not platonic guardian. People are taking bribes. There are people on the other side giving them bribes. They're trying to maximize whatever they can get away with. Clearly, once you take these political economy factors into account, the public policies which you get are very different from the ones which are being sold in your public book, in your public choice, or sorry, not public choice, in your economics textbooks, public policy textbooks. So I would say that one has to go back. You read Hume or you read Adam Smith, they were much more clear-headed. And the reason they accepted or they advocated laissez-faire was because they did not believe that governments were platonic guardians and that all economic agents were angels. There are very nice passages which you can find. I commend, I don't want to be a book salesman, but this Reviving the Invisible Hand, this is my contribution trying to justify all these things. A lot of the arguments, I mean, some of the arguments we brought up in that lecture the other day about technological change, you'll find the argument I was making, that's also in here. Okay, so now, so where do we go? Public economics, I think, is a dead end. There's other thing which has gone wrong, and I think this again is at the heart of the problem. There's a very famous theorem. Remember, when the classical liberals were talking about competition, and competition was the way to get efficiency, many theorists said, well, that's not good enough. And we go back to Corner and then the mathematical economist Arrow de Breu, they rigorously showed that what is called a perfectly competitive economy would give you all the efficiency properties which we want. Okay? And then from that theoretical model, any deviations from the assumptions which give you perfect competition are implied to lead to market failure, which leaves government intervention. Now, this has always seemed bizarre to me, because it's child's play to show that, I mean, you just look at the assumptions underlying perfect competition. Most of these are not met in the real world, which means this would justify massive government intervention. There's a subtle but nevertheless unmistakable difference in the conception of competition before and after the marginal revolution. Thank you. The modern concept of perfect competition, conceived of the market structure in which all producers are price takers and face perfectly elastic curves to their output, was born with Corner in 1838. Now, of course, I should say the French have been the leaders of all this dirigist dogma, as I call it, and the latest one has just got a Nobel Prize. And this is foreign to the classical conception of competition, and this was as a process of rivalry in the search for unrealized profit opportunities, whose outcome is uniformity in both the rate of return on capital invested and the prices of identical goods and services, but not because producers are incapable of making prices. In other words, despite a steady tendency throughout the history of economic thought to place the accent on the end state of competitive equilibrium rather than the process of disequilibrium adjustments leading up to it, this emphasis became remorseless after 1870 or thereabouts. Whereas a much looser conception of free competition with free but not instantaneous entry to industries is in evidence in the work of Smith, Ricardo, Mill, Marx, and of course Marshall and modern Austrians. For that reason, if for no other, it can be misleading to label classical economics as a species of general equilibrium theory, except in the innocuous sense of an awareness that everything depends on everything. Okay? Now, the same thing applies to monopoly and competition. This whole thing we were discussing the other night about changes in technology, I won't go into that now. So let's go on. Well, but I'm not going to talk about that. I've already talked about Ramsey rules. Okay, so if for taxation, commodity taxation, we've just seen that the best way of reducing those triangle costs is by following the Ramsey rules to tax goods in inelastic demand. Okay, now ask yourself the following question. That is the minimizing this consumption loss, which is the question which Keynes said Ramsey. But ask yourself the following question. Supposing you're a monarch or the leader of a predatory state, what do you want to do? You want to maximize revenue. What is the set of commodity taxes you'd use to maximize revenue? Goods with elastic demand curves or goods with inelastic demand curves? Let's go back to the diagram. Okay, that's a relatively elastic. Inelastic demand curve is there. What would maximize revenue? Inelastic. So it turns out that the Ramsey taxes are also the taxes the predatory state would use. Okay, so it's not surprising why all modern day public economists like Ramsey taxes. This gives the state the largest stake it possibly can. Okay, so Brennan and Buchanan asked themselves the same question. They said, supposing you were not a predatory state, and you're really interested in the interest not of the predator but of the prey, what is the set of taxes which would give you the sufficient revenue to provide public goods, okay, but which would not give the state this revenue maximizing amount in Ramsey taxes? What is it? Turns out the only set of taxes you allow are ones with relatively elastic demand. Why? Because that allows tax competition. If the government raises taxes too highly, you can move, which also implies movement between countries with different tax regimes. Okay? Now, to show you how powerful the other side is, Jim Buchanan he was always in favor of the common market because he said these different state jurisdictions in this unified market means there will be tax competition amongst all these jurisdictions, which will lower the general burden, and you won't get this predatory tax maximization taking place. Let's see what's happened. Under the under the Commission, but more so under the OECD now, which started off as a liberal organization, what they've started doing is organizing what I call a cartel of predatory states. What are they saying? They're saying we must have a common tax code throughout the world. So if you're in Jersey, you've got a tax account somewhere else, all this tax competition, that must end. And what ultimately we converge to? The interest of all these states is, of course, on the Ramsey taxes, i.e. this. So that is a sure way of raising the tax burden. So the first thing to recognize is that anyone who tells you that a state is looking after the national interest or what have you, this is broadly a lie. Democracy is looking after the median voter. In autocracy, they're looking after whoever the autocrat is. In oligarchy, they're looking after the current oligarchy. So essentially what you have to ask yourself is what is the best way of raising the necessary finances for providing the ordinary public goods at the least cost to the prey. And those turn out to be taxes which maximize tax competition, actual and potential. Okay. So Brendan, those are better than that. Okay, now the other big difference, of course, between what I call the classical liberal and social democratic view of the state, which affects all aspects of public policy, this is best demonstrated by a distinction which I think Michael Oakeshott made. He's a political philosopher in England, and he made a very important distinction between a state which views itself as an enterprise. trying to achieve some end. Now, amongst the substantive enterprise of states through history have been religious, Calvinist Geneva, or today ISIS trying to legislate a state, create an Islamic state with Sharia law. So that still continues. The second is nation building. Now, this was the aim of many of the nation states which were created in 16th century Europe, where the state, the monarchs were using the state. And it's the power of coercion, because the state is a monopoly of coercion. That's one of the definitions of the state. They were using to create nation states. Okay, and that is a very important motive again in many third world countries for also the dirigist policies. Enterprise was built a nation state. And of course, the most common one, and this goes back to the 19th century with Marx, is equality. But it's not just that. Okay, so that's now Oakeshott said this view, the enterprise view of the state, goes back to the Judeo-Christian tradition, and particularly the egalitarian part of this tradition, because unlike if you take any other polytheistic religions, they've all been hierarchical. I mean, the Hindus believe in reincarnation, which means, you can't, as I keep telling people, all my Indian friends who claim to be social democratic egalitarians, I say, you can't be, and they're also good Hindus. I say, how can you be a good Hindu? Because what you are in this life, you could be a worm, you could be a Brahmin, you could be untouchable, depends upon what you did in your last life. And if you now want to equalize things in this life, you're really going against God's purpose. You're going against reincarnation because this is your due. So the only religions which actually turn out to be egalitarian are those which have arisen in this part of the world. And they are the ones which are monotheistic. And if you believe that there's only one God and your relation with one God, then how can you not believe in the equality of all souls? So egalitarianism is something which infects the Judeo-Christian, and that was Oakeshott. So he said that is one tradition, okay, which leads to the enterprise view of the state. The other view of the state, that goes back to the Greeks. And this looks upon the state as a civil association. The role of the state is just an empire between clashing interests. And that, of course, is very much the classical liberal view. That the state tries to maintain what Adam Smith called natural liberty, and is just adjudicating between these different interests. So the main purpose of the state is to create a system of law which the state upholds. And it doesn't have no enterprise of any of these other things which it should be involved in. Now this so let's go back. Now, well, modern welfare, that's true. Modern welfare economics, public policy now, it doesn't support collectivism anymore, partly the reasons I gave you. It does separate, gives you some reason, like believing in free trade, but even government intervention. It doesn't believe in collectivism of the old-fashioned sort, but it is egalitarian, the social democratic egalitarian. Now, one of the things which I find people find very difficult to swallow is the classical liberals, right from David Hume downwards, have always looked upon equality as conflicting with liberty. Okay? And the best example, the most recent example, is the book by Nozick. And as you say, the socialist society would have to forbid capitalist acts between consenting adults. There's a whole lot of huge hoo-ha and fuss about growing inequality. People are getting millions. Bill Gates gets millions. Young Zuckerberg creates Facebook and becomes a billionaire overnight. Now the thing is, all these, so these are all, huge, innovative people who got rents. They're not like Goldman Sachs bankers who you can argue didn't earn their money, but these people have. Question is, if you wanted egalitarianism, you'd have to take away their money. Okay, and if supposing you're an athlete or a great singer, every time you go on a concert, again you get millions. The government can come and take that away and give it away. So effectively, what you're saying is that you have some view that there should be no differences between people. Now let me give one poignant example of where this leads to. My wife and I were recently traveling in Indochina. We were in Cambodia, where I noticed one thing which I'd also seen in China many, many years ago. But here's much more extreme. In China, the first time I went in 1984, this is after Deng Xiaoping's opening up, etc. And I was lecturing at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And we were all staying in their hostel there. And the astonishing thing is, with the age distribution, there were either very old men, old professors, very distinguished, who studied with Schumpeter and all these other places, big and hard. And they just come back from pig farms after the Cultural Revolution. And the other were very young. There was no intermediate. Why? Because all the intermediate generation were Red Guard, they'd been killed, whatever it is, they never got educated, and that was it. In Cambodia, where you just were, it was much worse. There were no old people. All the professionals, anyone with any education, were about the same age as my daughter, who was about 34. There was no one older than 35. And the reason is very simple. Mao's Cultural Revolution was also against, remember, inequalities, these inequalities, as I said, if you're a singer, you've got a natural talent, okay? Human capital, which people have, education, what have you, that leads to inequalities. Okay, and Mao then thought, part of the egalitarian thing, all these educated people, these flunkies, engineers, so the Red Guards went and put dunce caps on them and made it difficult for any teachers to work. All teachers were exploiters and all sorts of stuff. And as a result, they didn't believe in education. Pol Pot went one further. In fact, there's a document he wrote. Mao is not really revolutionary because he said they've got some of these terms the communists use. They've said still left these seeds which can then grow into an unequal thing. He said the best thing is to kill these people, anyone who's educational. So he literally had people who had any education whatsoever. He kept a few engineers to keep things going. They didn't want to waste bullets. So you can see this in Cambodia, the killing fields. They had hammers, and anyone who had education, they hammered their brains out. Their skulls are there. Now that's where equality leads you. To say this is pure fantasy, there's a Marxist economist, John Romer, who wrote a book. Actually, I don't think he was advising Pol Pot, but he wrote a book about the same time, which I remember reviewing, in which he argued the same thing. He said the real inequalities, human inequalities, are inequalities due to differences in human capital. And we have to find some way to do this so we don't end up with new inequalities in meritocracy. Now let me tell you people who believe in equality. Another form of egalitarian, which again, he's very smart. The other form of egalitarian, which Pol Pot saw, and which I suppose is true, he said, good-looking people only marry good-looking people, okay? So we had marriage ceremonies where he decided who the good-looking people, where men and women should marry. The first thing was, anyone who's disabled immediately got a partner of their choice. And there were these huge fairs when, in fact, these marriage things took place. Of course, they didn't last after he fell. But there you are. So again, you equalize this. And this, of course, is a theory which Amartya Sen has been propounding under the name of capabilities. That we need equality, be a lot of unequal capabilities, what need to equalize that through various compensatory things. Well, Pol Pot did that. So it's a very dangerous route, this enterprise route. And as a result, classical liberals have never believed that equality and liberty are necessarily compatible. And if you choose between two, always choose liberty. Okay, so what is classical liberalism and laissez-faire? Laissez-faire is not against the state. In fact, it needs a strong state. What it means is the state should confine itself to providing the basic public goods, which is law and order, etc. But they also accept that because of inequalities, you should have public transfers to what in the 19th century used to be called the deserving poor. That means people who are poor, not because they work shy or what have you, don't want to put in effort, because of no reason. The obvious thing are people who are disabled, widows who couldn't work, various other people like that. And the next form where you needed public finance, and this was also true of Marx incidentally, they thought that you should have public financing of merit goods like health and education, but not provision. There's no reason why the state should run the health system or education system. All you should make sure is that anyone who cannot afford health, I think, that is supplemented. So that is also part of the classical liberal package. Okay, so here's the conclusion. You cannot separate what the welfare, which you're sold on a normative analysis. This normative analysis, we just assume the state is filled with benign platonic guardians who have a social welfare function, looking after the interests of everyone, which they maximize subject to the usual constraint. This is all garbage. Don't forget about it. This is, it's good for your intellectual muscles, but don't take it seriously. Okay, so you have to take a view about the nature of the political economy. Without that, the rest doesn't hold. You cannot do public policy without understanding political economy. The second conclusion I'd like to emphasize, that even within the social democratic view of the role of the state, this is public economics, and we've seen this. Now, there you again have the validity of the classical liberal case for laissez-faire and free trade. Remember that diagram I showed you? I didn't change the argument. I just said this is all I changed was the assumption that the state did not consist of platonic guardians. So they didn't know whether these chaps are telling lies or the truth, the predatory, what have you. So everyone is self-seeking, and that's sufficient to give you rent-seeking for both import quotas or subsidy-seeking in case of tax subsidy, things to deal with domestic distortion. So even within that framework, the policy conclusion which you get is laissez-faire with free trade. So in that sense, that is even stronger. Forget about keep your social democratic credentials, you'll still end up with that. Okay? So the last thing, of course, I say that if you look around many countries, Tony Blair's New Labour, Clinton's New Democrats, they had virtually adopted the whole of the classical liberal package, except for merit goods. And Blair was moving towards that. He was stopped by Gordon Brown. But the most important thing, it seems to me, for sensible public policy is to give up this enterprise view of the state, whatever it might be, equality, Sharia law, nation building, what have you, and look upon the classical liberal view of the state as an umpire, a civil association view, which goes back to the Greeks. Thank you. Any questions?
How come Pol Pot and the Khmer didn't turn on themselves because they were all graduates of the Sorbonne?
You're absolutely right, and people pointed this out. He killed anyone who pointed out that he was a graduate, that Pol Pot was a graduate, I think. And they were very tightly knit. And then they did fall out towards the end. Yeah, the funny thing is, again, if you look at Ho Chi Minh, the Pol Pot, that whole group there, all these communists, they all became communists in France. And they all went to the Sorbonne. Pol Pot was part of the royal palace. He was brought up by sister married to or a concubine of one of the Sihanouk kings, and he actually was brought up there. And they sent him to a missionary school in Phnom Penh and that. All hidden. You can't, this all coming out afterwards.
Yeah. So could you expand on what you mean when you say the state is umpire? What does that mean?
Effectively, what the state needs is a system of law, that's the main thing, which is really adjudicating between conflicting interests. Because human beings being what they are, there'll be, people trying to steal, cheat, lie, etc. So the state should be completely neutral in terms of whatever enterprise these people are following, but it should just be an umpire in the sense of being a judge or support a judge which adjudicates between competing interests. So it's an umpire in this ongoing competition amongst individuals or corporations or what have you. And that's all you need the state. Apart from, of course, providing public goods and now these other extra bits which we accept because the system as it is, you need some public transfers for some reason.
So the state should be neutral on everything except the law.
Yeah. Everything. Everything. But it should maintain public order. So it has judges, police. It needs to maintain the independence of the state. You have an army. And beyond that, it has no purpose of its own. Yep.
You talked about taxation.
About taxation.
Yeah. I didn't really understand if you meant the taxation should be the most efficient for the government or the most efficient for the public?
For the public.
For the public. But what about the government? If you have to get...
Governments, it depends what you think of. The governments are filled with angels. Yeah, you always want to help angels, but they're filled with... That's it. So you need to give them enough of a tax base, okay, to provide money to pay for public goods and all this stuff. But it should be self-liquidating in the following way. If the government goes above what people consider a reasonable amount, people can leave. Now, one way is through tax competition. Supposing we could actually move our money wherever we like. Okay, and you have different states, and people can do it. In the United States, people can actually do it by physically moving between regions with different tax rates, as they do.
Right, but shouldn't we tax things like cigarettes and oil, which the demand is very low? And then we get the maximum that we can get from the people.
Okay, let me try out something else on you. Okay? People, supposing I start saying, I have a distribution of, well actually I can do it with IQ, supposing IQ tests. Okay? We have IQ tests. We know that people with high IQs are likely to, not necessarily, I'll show you the disadvantage, are likely to earn more. Okay? So instead of having an income tax, which you can fiddle, etc., every year, well, at the start of your life, now, we have an IQ test, and your tax rate for life is determined as the IQ test. You can't escape it, that's it. Would that be fair? And inescapable. Like cigarette taxes. But why isn't the cigarette tax socialist?
It's actually on the same subject. You said that we should tax inelastic goods in order to have competition between countries and tax policy. Doesn't it eventually will drive taxes to zero to have a really harsh competition between countries and tax rates?
Well, if you have that, look, there are certain reasons why. Supposing I live in a particular country, okay, I need sewage, I need sanitation, all this sort of stuff. So local public goods you can tax user charges, very simple way of doing things like that. But income taxes or corporate taxes, which is now the big issue, for instance, with the tax inversion in America, if a country wants to create a cartel saying the highest tax rate should apply to every corporation in the world, A, that's inefficient, and B, how do we know they've got the right tax rate? Because what will they do, the states? Whoever it is, forget about it, it's not communist in any state running this. What do they want to do? They want to raise as much money as possibly can for their own purposes. They decide who gets what. That's what they want to do. This Piketty just released a book which essentially wants all income to be socialized and the government should just hand out little handouts to people. That's the ultimate social aim. To each according, what is it? To each according to his needs, from each according whatever. So you give all your money and the government doles out. That's the ideal for them. So this all leads down this slippery slope.
Do you think we can actually, the states can go from nation building, and Israel was born in 1948, and obviously the idea of the state was bank and nation building. And because of that, a lot of laws and a lot of restrictions and regulations are born out of need. So do you think there is a way, or did it happen in the past that actually the state has to form of nation building became the civil association.
Well, I think one of the reasons, that's why Jim became very keen on constitutions. I never understood this, partly because I've been grown up where countries don't believe in constitutions. And he always went back to the US, because the US is one example, whatever historical reasons, which created the nature of the state, which was created by fiat as an enterprise, was actually a civil association. So you're right. Of course, unfortunately, the founder of the Israeli state were all socialists, so they created a socialist state, or quasi-socialist state. But that is true, that when you're building a nation, to just establish the basic laws, you have to be clear-headed. Many countries have done this, and they created laws which, in fact, are completely against what you might call a civil association view of the state. So that's it. That is an initial purpose might be that, but the state you end up with, hopefully, will be one which doesn't look upon its purpose as anything other. Yep.
You spoke about the difference between predatory states versus like seeing the state as kind of these angels. But in Israel, there's a tradition of seeing the state as angels. And it's kind of unnatural to even imagine that anyone who works for the state might be self-interested. So a lot of these assumptions are kind of like a shock. Because it's like, well, what do you mean? I might be employed by the state tomorrow to help the people, and the state is me, and I am the state. Is there any way to transfer that to change that view? Because it's not, it's like, I'm not sure if there's like, what is required to change that?
Well, enough examples of the predators of the states, which I'm sure exist in Israel, like everywhere else. That in fact, rent seeking is a very classic example, but a lot of other examples I'm sure exist here as anywhere else. But I mean, as you said, you can't to create a sense of a nation. I understand that can be an important thing, particularly if you're under siege, to give that. But to then end up by saying that the agents of the state are all angels, I mean, you're just leading yourself to be exploited in the worst possible way by the agents of the state, whoever they are, I don't care. And there's plenty of historic examples of that. Yeah.
Do you, in your opinion, have a sustainable situation where a country would have economic freedom but not political freedom?
Oh yeah. Hong Kong.
Hong Kong has political freedom up till now, at least.
It doesn't now. I've just been in Hong Kong. People they were sitting outside the government offices claiming that this is not a democracy, which is true. No, but Hong Kong was a classic example. It was a British colony. It was run from London, but it had all the economic freedoms, including civil freedoms. It's not just economic. Civil is also important. You must have the rule of law. And the reason the Chinese kept it and even agreed to this basic law is that they thought they could continue running it as a colony, which in fact they have, but have all these British economic and legal freedoms which they could then use for their own purposes in China. That's what brilliantly. Any other question?
There's a great deal of interest in concern, attention in this country in lack of competition. Versus there's a sense that for various reasons, there's a sense of power in the hands of
minority.
Yeah, there's a concentration of power, and it's necessarily the public interest. And the first inclination is how to break it up. And I've always been suspect of that from what I see in the United States, with actions against monopolies, trade commission, and just essentially exchanging one undesirable situation for another undesirable situation where you have bureaucrats determining how big coverage should be.
Well, there's no way they're going to. Let me read you this actually goes back to the discussion we were having the other day. I've found this passage in my book. This is from Schumpeter. Again, about competition. There's tremendous confusion. It all goes back to this perfectly competitive model which was created. It all goes back to that. Now, let me see if I can find the Schumpeter. Okay, here it is. There's a marvelous passage which I'll read out to you. This is Schumpeter on his process of competition and creative destruction. He's in capitalist reality, as distinguished from his textbook's picture. It is not that kind of imitative competition which counts, but the competition from the new commodity, the new technology, the new source of supply, the new type of organization. Competition which commands a decisive cost, a quality advantage, and which strikes not at the margins of profit and the outputs of the existing firms, but at their foundations and their very lives. This is what that chap was talking about, all these apps, IT apps. Okay? This kind of competition is as much more effective than the other as bombardment is in a comparison with forcing a door, and so much more important that it becomes a matter of comparative indifference, where the competition in the ordinary imitative sense functions more or less promptly. The powerful lever that in the long run expands output and brings down prices, in any case made of other stuff. It is hardly necessary to point out that innovative competition acts not only when in being, but also when it is merely an ever-present threat. It disciplines before it attacks. In many cases, though not all, this will in the long run enforce behavior very similar to the perfectly competitive pattern. Now, this insight has been actually formalized by a whole lot of people who call it, what do they call this? Is Baumol et al. Contestability theory. What they're really saying is, as long as a monopoly, anything is contestable, and Schumpeter is really saying most of the competition really comes from the outside. People are waiting in the wings to innovate and compete. As long as that is possible, then there are no extra, whatever you got, the rents which you can get are no larger than what the sunk costs, whatever your sunk costs were, which some competitor will have to do. You can't get earned rents ultimately bigger than that. So all regulation is completely pointless, and the only reason we do this is because we have this perfect competitive model. Jean Tirole, who's done this, if you look at his book, there's one formula which I remember, it runs to 2 pages for a rule for a regulator to deal with the account or whatever thing which he thinks is good. And what is he trying to achieve? He's trying to achieve a very complex industrial structure, something close to the perfectly competitive norm. Completely foolish.
So that's why I raised the issue, because there's a lot of interest in this here. I think what seems to be clear.
Well, I'll tell you who they should read. They should read Schumpeter, and they should read my colleague Harold Dempsey. And if you want a second-hand, quick shot, get Reviving the Invisible Hand, which summarizes the argument. No, this is complete bosh, because then they always fall back in natural monopolies. Okay? And natural monopolies, the Dempsey said, now UCLA IO school answer is very simple. It goes back to another chap called Chapman, I think, who talked of competition for the field and competition within the field. Okay, competition with the field is something which happens ex ante. So with a natural monopoly, people normally think, how do you regulate after some natural monopolist is already in power company, electric company, what have you. And the whole competition for the field is that the competition for acquiring that occurs before. So you auction the rights to produce electricity, whatever the national monopoly is, and the terms can vary, you can work that out. But it's got nothing. After that, it has to be just one owner, you forget about it, that's it.
So the issue is really not structure or there's too much concentration. The issue is is to check to see if there are barriers to entry.
That's it. And most often you'll find, the other thing my lot have shown, case after case, they say the standard model says, assume there is a monopoly. They say, where does the monopoly come from? And every case, apart from natural monopolies, they're because of some government barrier which is being created. So monopolies are created by governments rather than, they don't naturally arise just like, if they do, then they have the innovative type, which, because if you're innovating something, then automatically your first mover advantages, then our patents will protect you. And that's exactly right. That's exactly what you need, because that is the thing which drives the economy.
So here, another dimension that needs attention is not just barriers to entry domestically, but the trade issue.
Trade, yeah, trade is big. I mean, that's right. Trade is the best anti-monopoly device we have. Open up, that's the thing, always.
When we enter the field of state monopoly and we want to open the competition to other firms, should we open the competition only in the domestic area for Israeli companies or for the world?
Out to the world.
The world. But this will, of course, increase the import, but
You don't know. You don't know. I mean, the people assume, you see, all these assumptions. How do you know? Let me give an instance. Many, many years ago, we were discussing Chile yesterday. I was actually on a plane to Santiago, and I was sitting next to a chap who said he just come from, I said, what do you do? Chile. He said, I sell meal fish to Sri Lanka. So what do you sell? See, I collect fish, some sort of fish thing, which I sell to Sri Lanka. I said, but that's like taking coals to Newcastle. That's an island. There was plenty of this. But he found some little niche. I know how he found it. And he was exporting that. Now, could any planner, anyone else have predicted that Chile had a comparative advantage in selling fish to Sri Lanka? No. So, you see, all this stuff is a pretense of knowledge. We don't know about these things. And the only people who do are at a very micro level. This is what Hayek talked about. All this knowledge is held at a very, very micro level. You and I don't know, and we can't make predictions about this. People say about technology, we are now entering secular stagnation. How do they know? Could they predicted Facebook 5 years ago, 10 years ago Google? How do we know? That's a great hubris of modern human beings, particularly economists, that they believe they can predict. They can't. They can't predict next year's GDP. How the hell can they predict what's going to happen in technology?
I think that the tragedy is that we believe in democracy, and when inequality grows, the people on the bottom would vote for people that would promise them were promised equality because they want to get money because they're on the bottom. So in the long run, I don't understand how it's sustainable to have a country like you're describing, because we'll always have a cycle of the people on the bottom voting for socialist governments.
Well, one way is to disabuse them. Tell you how. There are a huge number of studies which have looked at the outcomes in democratic societies of the creation of welfare states. Okay? And what it shows is that parties, no matter what they say, what they do is they transfer income from both ends to the median voter. Okay? So, if you could somehow set up blogs or whatever, I don't care what it was, showing the people at the bottom of the ring that if you buy this rubbish, this is an indirect way of taxing you, and you think you're doing the rich down and nothing to do with it, no, that's not going to help. The middle class is the people who are benefiting. So the middle class capture the welfare state. The middle classes, I mean, it's us. We're the predators in democracies. So it's true. It's not. But that doesn't mean that it can't be changed, can't be affected. You can, maybe not, but at least people will be self-aware of what's happening.
Actually, I think one of the key problems, and I'm not sure I'm prepared to offer the answer to this, but is the complete separation of political reality from law and economic reality. So when political power and law and economic reality are completely separate, then you just have this problem. Because if we think of justice as democracy, as political power, so then I can just take a vote. You know, and, we can just decide who has too much, and we can take a vote and legalize that. That's what's going on. You can just take what that person has.
A much better way is to try and persuade your fellow citizens that this egalitarian is a dead end. It doesn't work for one simple reason. It'll always be perverted. People use this slogan and it'll just be a way for us predators to capture more of GDP. Now people realize that, they'll hopefully not fall for the egalitarian story and they'll go for, they'll go to flat tax, which is ideal, and that a lot of countries have adopted that. I didn't realize that Wisconsin has got a flat tax. Did you know that? Which they tried to change to progressive taxation, and one sort of classical liberal institute I'm associated with, they started a program and defeated this, saying that progressive taxation will lead to higher taxes, much better keep a flat tax. So, flat tax, so there are a lot of things like this which you can sell, but they sell not on the ground of egalitarian, but the ground of fairness. And saying that, you don't want the state, that you're the prey, they're telling you all these lies, they might even give you a little bit of food to fatten you up, but it's only so they can extract more for you.
Thomas Jefferson is such an American hero, and I'm not sure how much direct responsibility we should give him for the words in the American Declaration of Independence. But what's written there is really created a lot of the seeds of all the problems.
Of course it has.
They took the inspiration from John Locke.
Yep.
It said life, liberty, and property.
And Paine, Thomas Paine.
And it got changed from life, liberty, and property. It got changed to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So property got taken, and suddenly it was the job of government to protect the pursuit of happiness.
No, that's a big industry now. Happiness is a big, big industry.
We have time for one last very quick question.
I'm interested in your description of the state as an umpire, and I was wondering, in Israel, the state owns most of the land, and now we're talking a lot about gas and oil that's being found, and whether the state should own them, and whether they should be mostly owned by the people who develop them. I was wondering if the state could own these goods in your theory.
Well, well, let's back off. One of the reasons, look at the Shale Oil Revolution, okay? A lot of countries have shale oil. The only country which has been successful in exploiting this, without all these greens coming and shouting at you, shouting you down, is the US. Why? Because in the US, this goes back to the homesteader law, you own the land on which your house sits, but also everything underneath and up there. Your property rights belong to you. So it's very easy for shale oil companies to immediately say, yeah, we want to dig under your house. The chap said, yeah, how much will you give me? It's negotiated, and that was it. No opposition, nothing at all. The Greens were left with egg on their face because, given a choice being sustainable and getting the money, people don't normally choose the money, which is quite right. Now this is completely different. In Europe now, in England, they're trying, because there it goes back to the old tradition of the sovereign owned all the land. And they're now trying to bribe people by saying, okay, if you allow fracking here, then your council taxes will go down or something like that, etc. But they're trying to do a deal. But the ideal situation is, in fact, to transfer the land to people. I've always believed. The first act of land reform, people said you must take land away from the rich, give it to the poor. Take the land away from the government and give it to people.